Intelligence has always been a focal point of discussion when it comes to the South Asian geopolitics. Intelligence built ideas, narratives shaped policies, and policies brought historical dimensions that forever change history when it comes to South Asian affairs. Today we have a very important guest, rather I would say the first guest of our The Breaking Silos podcast, Dr. Paul McCaw. Dr. Paul is a noted historian, intelligence expert, and a scholar on South Asian affairs. And today we are delighted to have Dr. Paul on our podcast show. We are entering into the new realities of South Asian geopolitics, the new alignment, disalignment happening. China is becoming more and more vocal when it comes to the old world order and how the new world order is taking place. And obviously, we all know the how Trump administration is making new wavelength, which has never been, at least in the last 50 years, when it comes to the US foreign policy. My first question, and I would like to know about your way of perspective, how you see the difference between Western intelligence and non-Western intelligence, because when I was researching about your research work and ideas, I got to know your primarily research focus on non-Western intelligence agencies and apparatus. What's your take on the non-Western type of intelligence agencies and how it works? Flow to you, sir.
So yeah, I think there are lots of parallels between Western and non-Western intelligence agencies, but also some important points of difference, I think. So some of the parallels, I think, are the way those intelligence agencies have evolved. So if you take, for example, in the United Kingdom and the United States, United Kingdom intelligence agencies really began to evolve in a formal state-driven sense from about 1909, when British domestic intelligence, the British Security Service, which is now called MI5, on British Foreign Intelligence, Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, really became formed in 1909. And it's interesting that they developed along domestic and foreign lines. So two separate services, MI5 focusing on domestic security and MI6 focusing on external security. And if we move forward and think about India in that context, it's interesting that the Indian Intelligence Bureau, which was obviously inherited from the British colonial period and then came under Indian control in 1947, was first Indian appointed head of the Intelligence Bureau. Initially, until the formation of the Research and Analysis Wing in September 1968, India had one intelligence service, the IB, Intelligence Bureau, which was focusing on domestic and foreign intelligence. And I think after the sort of incidents, the war with China in 1962, but also the Pakistan war in 1965, then a whole series of reviews and inquiries into what had happened with intelligence and why Indian intelligence perhaps hadn't operated as efficiently or effectively as the government may have liked. Then we get sort of verification of the Intelligence Bureau into a domestic service, effectively, which the Intelligence Bureau is responsible for. And then a more foreign service, the Research and Analysis Wing, which is focusing on foreign intelligence and particularly focusing on India and China initially, and India's regional sort of backyard, really. So initially a foreign focus, but a limited geographic foreign focus on what's going on in India's, India's region, really, the Indian Ocean region. I think interestingly, as India's become a global power economically and politically in terms of its ability to project military strengths, then intelligence has become a really more important component of Indian foreign policy and statecraft. And India's intelligence footprint has become global. So it's followed the expansion of Indian economic and political power onto the global stage. Intelligence has then become a sort of much more sort of important facet of Indian statecraft. And the Research and Analysis Wing's ability to project its power has also become global as well. So it's interesting that intelligence really follows on the back of Indian sort of economic power and statecraft, I think, during those periods. Right? So we have a sense in which, in terms of domestic and foreign intelligence and how that's evolved in India, it's very much mapped onto, I think, what's been happening in Western intelligence services. One point I would make, and I think about the difference is I think India would benefit from a much more stringent oversight regime in intelligence. So I think because Research and Analysis, for example, reports into the Cabinet Secretariat and it's really responsible to the Prime Minister of its primary customer, it doesn't really have a strong sense of parliamentary oversight in India or independent oversight on intelligence services. I think that's slightly problematic in a democracy. I'm not saying that the intelligence oversight regimes in other Western countries, the United States, United Kingdom, are perfect. But they do have a sense of parliamentary oversight, or in the United States, congressional oversight on intelligence services, which is relatively robust. And I think that has helped to some extent in controlling or mediating the operations of intelligence services. So I think moving forward, India might want to consider a more robust parliamentary oversight regime, really, which acts as a check and balance against executive power when it comes to intelligence. So in some ways, there are lots of parallels. In some ways, there's some slight differences, I think, particularly around oversight. But both Western and non-Western intelligence agencies, I think, particularly in the case of India, India now has a very effective, very very all-encompassing intelligence service. I think it's really able to project its power on a global basis. So I think the research analysis wing is very highly regarded, for example, in the International Intelligence Community for both its reach and its range of what it can do in terms of its intelligence profile, really. I also think it's interesting that South-South intelligence connections are becoming much more prominent now. So, for example, in the West, we have the Spies intelligence network, a sort of Anglophone intelligence network, as it reached in the Second World War, where United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand form this intelligence club, which is quite an exclusive sort of club and doesn't really allow people from the South to sort of participate in that. But I think India sort of increasingly is forging links with other intelligence agencies, not only with the United States, United Kingdom, but other intelligence agencies across the South, which I think is really important. So those South-South intelligence connections, I think, are really significant in amplifying India's intelligence power and also India's intelligence authority throughout the South. So I think that's a really important development, which I think will gain increasing traction over time.
So if we see about the patterns regarding South-South intelligence cooperations, and we see there are two major intelligence agencies, India's RNW and Pakistan's ISI. There are other lot more from Turkey as well.
Yeah.
Are we seeing some similar mechanism, if I ask regarding ISI operates and how RNW operates, are there any certain similarities of operations, institutional procedures, for example, executive control over that? If you can shed light on that as well.
Yeah, I think ISI and research analysis wing do have elements in common. I think their differences are probably more pronounced than the areas of commonality, really. I guess the big difference between ISI in Pakistan and the research analysis wing in India is that one is under domestic civilian control, my research analysis wing, and the ISI is a much more militarized service under direct control of the Pakistan army and ultimately a Pakistan head of state, but really it's the head of the Pakistan army who controls ISI and directs its operations. I'd also say ISI has a much more invasive influence with the Pakistani state. So we think about the way ISI operates both politically in terms of controlling or at least having a great influence over what happens politically in Pakistan, but also even economically in Pakistan as well, to the extent to which intelligence really is an important component of the Pakistani state. And if you then think about the research analysis thing in India, it's under civilian control. It doesn't have the same reach in terms of its influence over India's economic or diplomatic or political sort of landscape. So they are quite fundamentally different in that respect in terms of governance and the control they have over sort of state power. They also think they're different in terms of reach. So I think ISI is still a relatively regional organization. Its focus is very much on India and Afghanistan and the immediate vicinity of Pakistan. So the sort of securitization of the Pakistani state, ISI is at the heart of that. And really it's about regional security of Pakistan and Pakistan's immediate sort of defense requirements. I think the research analysis thing, although initially I'd say up to 1968, its famous example in 1971 in Bangladesh, research analysis wing with early Cal was very influential in the success of an operation in 1971 and the creation of the nation state of Bangladesh. Initially, I think RAW's focus was regional, so it was very important. The cooperation of Sikkim, for example, in the Indian Union in 1975. So lots of success regionally, at least initially. But I think over the last decade or so, as I said, as India's economic and political power has grown on the global stage, RAW has become much more expansive in its operations, both in North America, in Europe, and across Asia as well. So I think one of the points of difference is while ISI has remained largely, although not exclusively, focused on its neighbor, its own neighborhood, Pakistan's own neighborhood, or has become much more of a global intelligence service in a way that I don't think ISI actually is.
But sir, the shift we are seeing in the operation capabilities of ISI in countries like US, UK, Canada, and there are a lot of anti-India groups operating, separatist groups are operating, for example, Khalistan movement. Uh, and also ISI is also making a good footprints in Bangladesh as well after the new election or the new regime is coming. Uh, are we seeing a more hybrid nature of the ISI right now when at the time the Pakistan army is at all time, I would say, peak in the power in the last 25 years? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think hybrid warfare or grade A warfare has always been an element of any intelligence service. But I think the importance of that is certainly growing over time. So we think about the kinetic nature of warfare. It's still incredibly important. If you think about the Ukraine conflict, for example, in Europe, highly kinetic conflict, but it does have a really important grazing intelligence component. And if you maybe think about Operation Sindoor in more recently in a sort of South Asian context, again, an interesting sort of conflict in which there wasn't no direct cross-border forces, although there were actually missiles and planes firing missiles across the India-Pakistan border. But I think grey zone operations in that conflict were incredibly important in a way they haven't been before. So while kinetic operations are really important, and India, and Pakistan deployed fighter jets and the BrahMos missiles and all those sort of, remote operations and drones were really important in that conflict in Operation Sindoor. The actual boots on the ground element of that conflict had shifted and had changed from previous conflicts. And we think about 1962 and 65 and 71 and even 1999, the shift had been away from an exclusive focus on kinetic operations with individual troops and elements on the ground, and moved to more remote operations using high technology weaponry. And I think AI and grey zone operations have become really important and were demonstrated in Sindoor. So I was recently in Delhi last year in November.
Yeah.
And went to a couple of conferences where the avian head of the geopolitics was presenting some really interesting observations on Sindoor. And one of those observations was the extent to which grey zone and operations were really fundamental to Operation Sindoor, so the extent to which it was an information war in a way that hadn't happened before. The control of the information space is really important. That Indian intelligence and the Indian army were investing quite a lot of resources in trying to control and win that information space because it's so incredibly important. So the advent of AI, deepfake on a platform such as X and other platforms were really important part of putting that information warfare, really, I think. So it was interesting the way I think intelligence agencies are likely to become, particularly in South Asia and elsewhere, much more important facets of warfare, not only prior to that war, but during the conflict in managing that information space and trying to win it. So, yeah, it's an interesting series of developments, I think.
Following the one question which recently triggered in my mind when you talked about Operation Sindoor, I would like to add one example. When entire Operation Sindoor thing was happening, there was one Pakistani handle. Suddenly, account came and it posted an information. India's aircraft carrier caught fire and it got viral. And I am assuming a lot of Pakistani chaps and intel people pushed it throughout the way, when it comes to narrative warfare. So what do you think, what's your observation regarding India's preparedness, how India performed when it comes to information warfare, propaganda warfare? If I would ask you to rate it out of 10, where would you like to compare India, Pakistan on a 10 scale ladder? It's a quite tricky question, but yeah.
So really things that interestingly in the UK, the Defence Intelligence Agency, the RQK, because policymakers always want to have marks out of 10 or marks out of 100 and to evaluate intelligence, and they have intelligence benchmarks now where it moves along the spectrum from 0 to 100, and we try to give an equation there. I think India did very well in terms of its information warfare. It's by successful at debunking. Debunking is becoming incredibly important, I think, in grey zone warfare, and the ability to very quickly and very effectively and very credibly debunk deepfake imagery or information warfare by the other side is becoming incredibly important. So, as you mentioned, this aircraft carrier, the Russians are very good. attacks in Karachi and all sorts. Jets being shut down, how many Rafales have been actually shut down in the conflict, etc. Being able to authoritatively and definitively debunk those is incredibly important, because I think it also retains it's important in terms of escalation dominance as well. So I think disinformation has the ability to sort of interrupt that notion of escalation dominance and can be quite destabilizing in that sense. I think it did a really good job at that. I think it got better as Operation Sindoor progressed. So I think even the Indian Army now has come out and been quite candid and said, like, at the beginning of the conflict, maybe we weren't as effective as we'd like to have been in debunking and managing disinformation coming from an adversary. And I think, for example, they weren't having regular press conferences, they weren't challenging that information directly as they could do, both by television, radio, but also through social media as well. I think they learned a lesson quite quickly in Operation Sindoor that they had to get on the front foot with debunking those sort of stories. Otherwise, they can traction on social media incredibly quickly. They're disseminated at sort of lightning speed now. So unless you're debunking them really quickly, they can gain traction you don't want them to have. So I think India got better as Operation Sindoor went on, and I think its performance was actually quite effective in dealing with those issues. But also, I think it's a learning curve. So I think India, I think, is learning that disinformation sort of capability, and it will grow and gain importance over time. I think more resources will be employed by the Indian Army, but also all elements of the Indian Armed Forces to focus on disinformation and also to coordinate disinformation as well. So I think one of the things that Sindoor sort of brought out maybe is the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy need to be on the same page. So that level of coordination in terms of managing information operations is incredibly important.
One interesting observation which I observed after talking with a lot of my friends who are in US, UK and using TikTok, a Chinese platform. And I observed a lot of Pakistanis and Western accounts were using TikTok for propaganda warfare against India. And in India, we don't use TikTok. The government has banned TikTok after the Galwan clash. So do you think it was a leverage for Pakistanis or kind of a disadvantage for India? And when it comes to using these Chinese platforms, which are becoming really, really, I would say, penetrating all over the world as comparable to some Instagram accounts or some Twitter accounts. What's your take on this?
It's a really real problem because on the one hand, India's banned TikTok is trying to ensure Indian sort of communications and information security because obviously it's a Chinese company, and therefore there are concerns about finding the ability of China to penetrate into India's information space. On the other hand, you can completely see that coming off of those type of platforms, particularly when they have huge amounts of traction in countries like the United States, are problematic because there's no capacity then to manage that sort of information space proactively. So I think it's a dilemma that I think countries are going to have to grapple with. If you don't occupy that information space and you can see that information space through an adversary, then undoubtedly they will exploit it to their advantage. So I think probably the TikTok thing is tricky for India because obviously it doesn't want to expose its information network to penetration by China, but also if it doesn't engage with TikTok really, then it's going to create problems in terms of managing an information space that's just going to be important. And I think one of the things with platforms is they shift quite dramatically and quite quickly. So at one point TikTok might be incredibly awesome, it might shift to another platform in a year or 2 years' time. So I think completely coming off of those platforms, I'm not sure is an entirely great idea because you are completely ceding that space to an adversary, and that's probably what they'd want in any sort of information warfare conflict.
Is Pakistan able to cater the Western interest? I would say primarily the American interest, because there were a lot of say from President Trump, I came, I erased the war possibilities between India and Pakistan, otherwise it could have been a nuclear catastrophe. So what's your take on this? Because in India, Trump's remarks are not being taken seriously nowadays. It used to be, but nowadays I think a lot of credibility has gone into, it got eroded. What's your take on how you see Trump's engagement in the conflict?
Obviously Trump's an interesting character. He is a social sort of network that he uses. Is also quite active on other social media networks as well. So I think one of the lessons that probably become most important lessons that came out of Sindoor, I think, for India is the extent to which sometimes the best thing to do with with information warfare coming from the United States is perhaps to sort of, rather than amplify it and give it the oxygen of publicity, particularly when it comes to Trump. I mean, Trump's statements about being influential in sort of breaking up to sort of the end of the Syrian conflict. I think sometimes challenging that directly with an individual like Donald Trump is problematic, because not only does it create friction in that relationship, it just amplifies the dispute massively, and social media gets hold of it, and it becomes a big issue in India's relationship to the United States. I think the MEA, for example, as that conflict went on, probably learned that actually the best thing to do with those sort of things is to try and ignore them,
Yeah.
or marginalize them, or deal with them in a sort of as discreet a way as possible,
Yeah.
rather than going public with statements and allowing Donald Trump to respond, and then you get into this sort of back and forth really on sort of social media stats, which is not helpful to anyone. Trump will love an argument. He'll love to sort of engage with that. It's sort of, he loves the oxygen of publicity. He won't sort of shy away from engaging or criticizing in quite vitriolic terms. So it's almost like the best thing. I think I think the MEA probably realized or recognized the best thing to do in that situation is to try and defuse friction by non-engagement. I think that's probably the best policy in that circumstance, which sort of goes against, I guess, the issue of debunking, but in certain circumstances, the best thing to do is just to always draw from that base.
Okay. Okay. If we look beyond the current developments happening in South Asia, and let's focus once again on the historical developments and how intelligence shaped South Asian geopolitics. If I would like to shade highlights, if I would like to know your perspectives and what you observed, what you wrote in your latest book, Spying in the South Asia, how you see basically intelligence shapes South Asian geopolitics, and how today China is being a new player in the arena. Earlier it was KGB, MI6, ISI, RAW, CIA. Now the Chinese intelligence agency, MSS, and all these people are coming. What's the difference we are seeing, and where the trajectory is heading towards?
Yeah, I think there is a difference. I think one of the big legacies, which I sort of tried to bring out in the book, I think about one of the more toxic or unhelpful legacies of Western, but also Soviet and Russian. I'm thinking about KGB and Russian military intelligence, GRU, their intervention in South Asia, both in India and Pakistan during the Cold War period, and Western intelligence agencies, primarily British intelligence, MI6 and the CIA, but also other elements, West German intelligence, for example, is quite active in India. I think one of the legacies about that, bringing an intelligence Cold War to India. So, there are lots of elements to the Cold War. There's an economic Cold War, potential Cold War, a potential Cold War. But I think there was also an intelligence Cold War, and that was fought in South Asia in proxy terms between Western intelligence agencies, the CIA and MI6, and Soviet intelligence agencies, primarily the GRU and the KGB. And I think the fact that Cold War that intelligence Cold War was brought to India signifies how important India was geostrategically during that period. Economically, politically, ideologically, India was really important, both to the West and to the Soviet Union. Both wanted to win India as an ally during the Cold War because of India's latent power, but also because of the symbolism associated with Indian alignment and its importance within the global South. So I think that one of the legacies of that intelligence Cold War being fought in a proxy sense by the West and the East in India was to create a sense that intelligence was this invasive, anti-democratic, subversive force within India. So the focus was on the West and the East trying to manipulate Indian elections, to bind in politicians, to corrupt Indian democracy, and to unduly influence India's domestic and foreign policy. So it's a really unhelpful, toxic legacy. And I think it fueled an attitude of conspiracism towards intelligence. So intelligence became not a force for good, not a force that can guarantee national security or protect democracies and nation states. It became seen as a sort of a malevolent force, really, that was innately anti-democratic and hostile to India's sort of developmental project, really. I think that sense of conspiracy actually, to some extent, still exists. If you think about the CIA in the global South, and that's unsurprising because, with the Central Intelligence Agency, as we all know now, was involved in coups in Iran, in Guatemala, Indonesia, the Congo. So it does have a sort of a track record of trying to subvert democracies and nation states across the global South. I think India, unsurprisingly, sort of the strength and the persistence of Western and Soviet intelligence intervention in India fueled that sense of conspiracism against intelligence agencies. I think, particularly sort of Western.
It is still
intelligence agencies.
persist. Yeah.
The CIA is still regarded, I think,
Yeah.
across the global south as a sort of malevolent
Yeah.
subversive force. And I think that's problematic because the Central Intelligence Agency particularly has formed quite a strong partnership with the Research and Analysis Wing over the last few years, but it still has that sort of stigma amongst sort of the non-elites, I guess, or we're outside of government in terms of it's still problematic to openly say we are working with the Central Intelligence Agency, or that stigma's still there. So I think that's problematic in many senses. So a sort of toxic legacy that comes out of that process. I think interestingly, the more recent intelligence focus has shifted, which I think is important, from ideology and the Cold War sense of capitalism and communism. I see it almost the end of history, at the end of the Cold War, and then we could debate whether that's credible or not. But it shifted from ideology, I think, to economics. So you think about the MSS, for example, China's Ministry of State Security, and their intelligence efforts in India. They tend to be focused, I think, on subverting India's infrastructure, economic infrastructure, since the famous thing and after Galwan in 2020.
Investments.
By going dark and its infrastructure being targeted in a cyber attack by MSS.
Yeah.
But also I think MSS targeting intellectual property as well and high technology, and the risk that MSS is really focused on amplifying and accelerating China's economic development by accessing high technology, whether it's chip technology or any form of AI or high technology quantum computing. That's really what they're focusing on. So I guess the primary risk for India from excellent intelligence agencies such as China is on how do you protect India's economy, its industry, its startups, its high tech and AI sort of elements of its economy from Chinese industry espionage effectively.
Great. Regarding Bangladesh, I would say Bangladesh is becoming the most important topic right now in foreign policy discussions in Delhi, and the developments and the reports and all the theories, I would say the conspiracy theories are coming regarding America. CIA wants to create a Christian state in India's northeast, Bangladesh, Myanmar. I don't know how much these reports are true, but if I take them as a pinch of salt, because there were historical baggage, I would say CIA is still carrying on its back regarding democracy promotion, bringing regime change. What are the developments we can see after the Jamaat and BNP are back in the power? How it can sabotage the entire South Asian geopolitics, and overall how it can impact India's outreach regarding consolidating first its neighborhood and then going towards Indian Ocean, countering China there, because I am saying there are a lot of power plays happening in South Asia, and nobody thought a few years back the new Cold War would start with one of the core focal point that would be South Asia. All major powers are coming, Russians are coming there. There is a good presence of Russians in Bangladesh. We are also there. Americans are there, Chinese. How you see the development in Bangladesh? Are we seeing some sort of thaw in the relationship between India and Bangladesh in upcoming years, or it going to be more worse? What we can expect?
Yeah, I think Bangladesh is going to be very interesting. Obviously, a huge process of upheaval over the last 18 months and but successful elections now. So hopefully some form of stability coming to Bangladesh. But I think it is a really crucial and pivotal point. I think it's really interesting and important that the West, for example, that isn't seen to unduly influence or interfere in Bangladeshi domestic politics. So you still, we mentioned that Cold War toxic legacies. You still have a legacy of which is the assassination in 1975, and some conspiracy theorists say, well, the CIA was linked to that, and the CIA was involved in an assassination. There's no, I think, credible evidence that really CIA was fundamentally involved in that assassination in Mujib. It was much more domestic issue, I think, but there is that sense in which Western interventionism, in an anti-democratic sense, is really important. So I think the West needs to be really careful about how it engages with Bangladesh in a really delicate period in Bangladeshi politics. I guess, from India's perspective, I guess it was a real sort of shock that Sheikh Hasina was removed from office so quickly on the back of the student protests and so unexpectedly. And I think to some extent that caught New Delhi and research analysis system off guard. I think so they were aware of that sort of issue, but I don't think they expected it to develop at the speed and the pace it did, and then the way it developed. And of course, the interim period when UNIS is overseeing what happens in Bangladesh, and Jamaat Islam seems to be consolidating the power. It's already troubling time for India.
Yeah.
I guess the most recent elections where the BNP has really won a landslide victory and consolidated its power, and offers an opportunity, I think, for India to engage with Bangladesh in a much more productive way. So I think there's a narrow window of opportunity, and then Narendra Modi has reached out to Tariq Rahman and has tried to sort of rhetorically establish some sort of connection there to get relations of chip back on a sort of a more stable footing. So I think things are really uncertain, but I think there is a window of opportunity for India to recalibrate its relationship with Bangladesh. We're not saying that I think that relationship is going to immediately get back to the sort of the closest strategically and politically of the Hasina period, but at least it might get a period of stability. And I think India's probably India's biggest card is economics. I think, India could offer a really strong economic sort of model for Bangladesh in terms of developmental aid, and in terms of, reinvigorating, I guess, different sort of structures and like Look East, Act East, or even BIMSEC and getting those structures back in place, which will enable India to use its economic power regionally to stabilize that relationship and build trust and influence of Bangladesh. I guess the thing India needs to be aware of, I'm sure it is conscious of, as it doesn't want sort of China, Pakistan, and even Turkey. It's now, becoming more interestingly involved in Bangladesh as well. So have those those nations sort of developing an overweening or overwhelming influence in Bangladesh. Obviously, that's going to be problematic for India as well. So on the one hand, I think it sees a window of opportunity. On the other hand, there is a sort of concern, I guess, within Delhi about Pakistan, China, Turkey, nations, holding really strong strategic defense and economic links with Bangladesh, which again might lead to that sort of issue of India having unfriendly powers surrounding in its neighborhood. So yeah, I don't think we quite know yet how that's going to play out, but I think it's in a position of flux, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how Delhi is able to manage that relationship to at least get Bangladesh to be a sort of a cooperative power, if not it's not as close a relationship as it was on the Senior issue.
As far as Turkey is concerned, as you rightly pointed out, nobody thought few years back Turkey would be one of the core element of espionage operations in South Asia, be it Pakistan case, be it Bangladesh. Turkey is playing a key role in the entire intelligence apparatus for narrative warfare, and they are really, I would say, amazing how they are using their soft power narrative. If for example, if putting their famous show, the Itrugul Ghazi, a lot of fan following within South Asia, the Pakistan, Bangladesh, I believe they are integrating the soft intelligence apparatus or penetrating the propaganda through movies with hard, real interest objectives. What do you think about Turkey's ambitions? What is it? It's just merely about Ottoman, reviving the old Ottoman things related to that, or Erdogan's plan of pan-Turkism, how it see Turkey rather being a regional power to a middle power in the region, and what big Turkish stakes are in the region right now? Because it's going to be a very interesting case. Turkey is an interesting case, yeah.
It is a really interesting case, and I think I completely agree with you that it's a surprising case in many senses, because I don't think many geopolitical commentators expect Turkey to be so interventionist so soon, particularly in South Asia. So I think it has come as a surprise that Erdogan, given the domestic issues that he's had, and the fact that he's been preoccupied by consolidating his own position in Turkey, rather than thinking about anything externally, particularly in South Asia. The extent to which Turkey now seems to be sort of trying to project its power and gain influence in South Asia, I think is really interesting. Obviously, developing a relationship with Pakistan is yet more, a lot closer. You think about Sindor and the extent to which Turkey is, an important component of Pakistan's defense now. And sort of projecting that power to Bangladesh, I think is also, of course, a concern for Delhi. I think you're right that one of the most interesting things is this ability for Turkey to combine hard power and soft power in really effective ways. So I think it's quite a sophisticated approach. I mean, they did like Bilal Erdogan and Mesut Ozil, the Premiership footballer, moved to, went into Bangladesh recently. And so there is this element to use both film and culture and sport as a means of soft power to try and bring those countries closer together, alongside the use of hard power, military power and economic power as well. So yeah, it's quite a sort of sophisticated approach by Turkey, I think, in the sort of in trying to win influence. Yep, and I think that sort of shift has happened quite quickly, and I think it's taken a lot of people by surprise. And obviously, they are disconcerting for Delhi in terms of we already expected this player to be quite so influential in his backyard quite so quickly. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how the maybe government responds to that, and whether they try to counter that by reaching out to Erdogan and trying to establish closer relationships with Turkey. It's obviously a point of strategic concern, I think, to India, because the last thing India wants to go back to is having had a period where it's been relatively secure in its neighborhood and had a buffer of friendly state around India.
Yeah.
Quite quickly over the last 18 months, that situation has changed.
Yeah.
I see that the window of opportunity for India to recover some of that ground in Bangladesh and elsewhere. But also you could envisage it going back to a problem where India is in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar. All of a sudden these states become not exactly hostile to India, but not particularly friendly to India.
Yeah.
I think obviously that's a strategic concern. That notion about geostrategic encirclement, which is something India is rightly, I think, concerned about. And Turkey's sort of intervention in South Asia is just complicating that sort of issue and that concern, I think.
Yeah, because there are a lot of investment, partnership, trilateral highway cooperation linking India with Thailand and Gulf of Vietnam via Myanmar. I'm seeing all these projects right now in kind of a stalemate situation. So if we look beyond South Asian geopolitics, a very interesting question came in my mind regarding how these large corporations, for example, Palantir, nowadays a lot of news making around Palantir, how it is being used in the entire Venezuela episode, how private intelligence apparatus is coming into the picture, and what's overall take regarding the coming of this private intelligence into the overall intel community of the world, because we have seen how private military came in the Ukraine crisis, Wagner Group and all. Do we have examples of private intelligence companies and how lethal they can be when it comes to sabotaging large state interest in the region, particularly in South Asia? Are we seeing any trend there?
So I think Palantir is a really interesting example, I think, where it does seem to have gained significant traction within the US government, but also in the British government as well. So it got some controversy recently in Great Britain over the extent to which Palantir is winning contracts with British defence organisations and defence companies that are uncontested, so not subject to open bids. The British government seems to be awarding contracts to Palantir without any sort of competitive bidding process. And there is concern about the extent to which those companies are embedding themselves in the sort of defence infrastructure, not in the United States, but also in Western European countries as well, whether that's a good thing in terms of control. I think a lot of that in the European context comes down to both economics in the UK case, and that they don't have the economics of heft anymore to develop those sort of technological solutions very quickly, but also the sort of race in Europe to try and accumulate greater kinetic capabilities and intelligent capabilities, given the threat that's coming from Russia and given the concerns about, once the Ukraine conflict ends, at some point it will end, inevitably, what that then means for Russia and its more expansive use. So there are issues, geostrategic and regional issues that are driving that. I think inevitably that's going to spill over in terms of how companies like Palantir, they have global objectives, if you mentioned, active in the Venezuela operation and America using AI in its defense capabilities really for the first time in kinetic operations. So we are in a period of transformation, I think, where high technology, private intelligence companies are being embedded in what's traditionally been an exclusively state sort of business in terms of those kinetic operations. I'm sure Palantir will be lobbying and be actively trying to get a slice of the market in India or elsewhere because it's such a potentially lucrative market. And I guess we'll be seeking to exploit instability in any region and security concerns in any region for their own economic profit. I think it's potentially quite troubling that a private intelligence company is doing that. You're absolutely right. In Ukraine, based open source intelligence companies, but also more kinetic companies like Palantir have been really significant, I think, in the way that conflict has sort of evolved over time and the extent to which it's continued as long as it actually has. So yeah, I don't know about any specific details about Palantir and how it's engaging in South Asia, but I would be incredibly surprised if they weren't actively looking at the government to get some sort of foothold in the Indian defense industry, because it is such a lucrative industry at the moment, but it's going to grow over time as India's economic power increases, which it will do. As the economy grows, which it will do, as India becomes much more of a global player, which it will do, then that market is just going to be so attractive to players such as Palantir. And yeah, I think then we get into the issues, we'll circle right back, I guess, to the beginning of the conversation, when we get into issues around democracy and oversight and an agency, whether you want those companies to be embedded in your defense infrastructure, when it's quite difficult to control them or to know what they're actually doing. So yeah, I have reservations over Palantir and how much nation state should be engaging with those sort of institutions and specifically on what terms as well.
Yeah, because Palantir's CTO Shyam Sankar, in his recent book Mobilize, he talked about India's importance and bringing these technologies, for example, Palantir, to key partners, allies like India. So I would say I am quite hawkish regarding Palantir's participation in upcoming years in India, and I don't know how our security apparatus, military intelligence, how they look into it. But unfortunately, we have to live with the reality, because if we are going more closer to the American side, which is quite visible after the free trade agreement and all these settlements happening right now, maybe India will be, I would say, coerced to go or use the Palantir tech. Or maybe we can see a lot of technology transfer regarding that thing, because a lot of new startups in India are coming regarding private intelligence setup and all. As far as technology is concerned, and linking with the ideology question, as you mentioned, in the Cold War, the ideology was the focal point of espionage, intelligence operations. So what we seeing when it comes to social media platforms like X, Twitter, which is obviously X, Instagram. Twitter is considered as the core base of right-wing American, European population, and Instagram is more widely spread in, I would say, India, South Asian country, Africa. It's my observation. Which platform you think is more lethal when it comes to information and narrative warfare, which can be leveraged more in terms of information and propaganda warfare, either Instagram or X? What's your take on this thing?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think it's not a static issue, it's dynamic and fluid, so it changes over time, and I think it even changes over the course of a conflict. So I would still say, on balance, that X is probably the most influential in terms of shifting public opinion. And again, I guess we need to consider what type of public opinion we're trying to shift. So Instagram obviously still owned by Meta, and so still owned by a large American corporation. But I think a lot of the content that's going on there is still very much focused on non-political solution narratives, and certainly less, as you said, less right-wing, less extreme or radical on both ends of the spectrum, I guess. I guess X still has the capacity to sensationalize, to engage in ways that probably Instagram doesn't. I think it's probably generational as well. So Instagram tends to have a younger profile, and X tends to have a profile of people that are maybe slightly older in age range, but also people who might be of a different sort of political or social persuasion. So I think, I would say at the moment it's X, but X is becoming, it's going to go through a transitional phase, I think, where some people are coming off of X, and it's it's because of the sort of toxicity that's associated, the right-wing toxicity that's associated with that platform. Again, so going back to the issues before about conceding the information space, I'm not actually sure that's a great idea, because then you just concede that space, which is still has a huge reach and is hugely influential with core constituents of economic and political sovereignty and then influences within various countries. If you concede that space to people who are sort of quite radical, then yeah, I think I'm not sure that's necessarily a great idea. So you're considering a really important information tool to people you might not necessarily agree with. So, but I would say X generally at the moment is probably more influential than Instagram. That may change over time, but yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have discussed a lot of things regarding how the world is shaping in the geopolitical realities, where South Asia really stands, insights from your book, X, Instagram, Turkey, Bangladesh. But there is a last question, and which is very important.
Sure.
Afghanistan. What's your opinion? How you seeing the development regarding Afghanistan and the entire?
Sorry, I might have lost you there, MJ. I think I'm back.
Yeah. No, we'll sort it out in editing. Yeah. How you see developments in Afghanistan, because there are a lot of reports coming. Americans are planning to get their base back, Bagram. Iran chapter is already in the leak. Russians are involving there, especially in the northern Afghanistan side. There are a lot of presence of Russian, Turkish groups. And India is also making new partnership with unconventional friends, Taliban.
Yeah.
How you see the Afghanistan development?
Yeah, Afghanistan, I think, obviously is still highly unstable, and so the Taliban regime is still sort of consolidating its internal power. I think the key thing is it could still become one of those areas where of great power contestation, as you said. I think the West is really concerned about Afghanistan. I think, and you're right, two reasons. One, strategic is a base of operations, so Donald Trump's focus on Bagram, and as a sort of base for projecting US power into the region. And on the sort of the importance of Bagram as a base to doing that. I think the West, interestingly, has also recently began to wake up to the extent to which the Taliban is not necessarily facilitating, but tolerating the growth of extremism within Afghanistan. I'm thinking about radical groups who might operate in a terrorist context against the West. So I think Western security intelligence agencies are becoming increasingly concerned about the growth or resurgence of organizations like Al-Qaeda and using this as basis for operations out of Afghanistan. So that is sort of encouraging a more interventionist stance, I think, or will encourage a more interventionist stance on the part of Western intelligence and security agencies who feel, Afghanistan's one of those countries, isn't it, where the West intervenes and then it forgets about Afghanistan, and then Afghanistan becomes a problem and it intervenes again and it forgets about Afghanistan. So this notion that I think is gaining a traction in security circles in the West, that Afghanistan is beginning to become more problematic in terms of the growth of Al-Qaeda and acting as a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, which might be problematic for the West. But as you say, Afghanistan, potentially is a critical route for China and Pakistan in terms of the trade route, and particularly in terms of critical minerals as well. So here's the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor going to go through Pakistan. I mean, how is Afghanistan going to be seen as a conduit or a transit point for international trade, particularly involving Pakistan and involving China? So I think that battle for Afghanistan as a geostrategic piece of real estate, which is really important as an economic and strategic corridor, is really going to gain traction over the next few years, I think. So to what extent the Taliban is going to cooperate with particular nation states or particular political constituencies and form alliances, de facto alliances with those states is really important. I think India in terms of its willingness to reach out to Taliban, it's quite a smart strategic hedge. I don't think, again, you want to concede that space to India's adversaries. So, although India may have issues with the Taliban, and obviously it's been quite controversial in India about how that relationship is getting traction, just in terms of pragmatically from a security perspective, it makes a lot of sense to maintain a dialogue, to maintain communications, and to make some sort of relationship with the Taliban because of its strategic importance to India. I think it's going to be absolutely crucial. So, yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting period to see what direction Taliban moves in and to what extent the Taliban is going to try and seek to leverage. It knows it's going to be important as an economic and political corridor. It knows there are security concerns in the West about the aggressive terrorism and actually terrorist base. The Taliban has sort of needed the leverage, I think, and it's really interesting to see how other states around manage that sort of crisis. Obviously, Pakistan will be desperate to get back in and increase its influence in Afghanistan. Again, that provides a security issue for India. So, yeah, I think Afghanistan is going to become an increasingly important focus of regional and Western and Russian attention and Chinese attention over the course of the next 3 to 5 years in a way that it hasn't really been. It's sort of gone under the radar a bit, I think, over the last decade or so. But now it's becoming, much more important as a center of geostrategic conflict. So, yeah, I think it's absolutely incumbent from the Indian perspective that New Delhi focuses on that as a real area of concern that it wants to manage and try and control as much as it possibly can.
Because what I am seeing regarding Afghanistan development, it's a clear case of departure from traditional moralism in Indian foreign policy and Chanakyan way of dealing with the neighbors, how he theoretized the entire thing millennia back. You have to be real politic in the arena. Yeah. At the end of this entire podcast, my final take regarding you, what are the 3 challenges that you are seeing in South Asian geopolitics? What are these core challenges you would like to mention?
So I think one of the key challenges for India is the United States. Obviously, Trump is a very unpredictable and capricious politician. Trump is not going to be there forever. Well, hopefully he does stand by the US Constitution. He was. Trying to serve, which I think he will do, but it's not the other possibility. But while the Trump administration is in place, India has to deal with a very powerful and important economic and strategic partner, but one that's very capricious and unpredictable. And I think, both strategically and economically, I know the trade deal with the United States is pretty much negotiated, I guess. We can debate whether that's a good thing for India or a bad thing for India. But I think managing the United States in a way that's very different. I mean, if we think about the post-Cold War period for 20, 25 years, India had a progressively, more interlinked and productive relationship with the United States, and the Trump administration dislocated that process or stronger and stronger economic, strategic, and even cultural links between the United States and India. I think the Modi administration is trying. I think it's a good idea to become more multilateral, to try and follow a policy of multi-alignment. So obviously, just the trade agreement with the European Union, and von der Leyen coming to India and securing that trade agreement as a core part of our hedging strategy. I think, again, buying Rafales from France is another important part of our hedging strategy. And so I think India is sensible to try and keep as many options open as it possibly can and to reduce its strategic and economic dependence upon the United States. And I think, interesting, there are recent developments that will help India in that regard. Today, the United States Supreme Court struck down Trump's tariff policy, and that immediately opens up opportunities for India to maybe go back and think about how it can not even necessarily renegotiate, but use it sort of leverage it coming off the back of that to get a better trade deal with the United States, or to think about how I can use that leverage against the Trump administration. So I think Delhi is going to be really wise to not put all its eggs in one basket, not to focus on the United States exclusively, but to try and balance America's strategic power against the European Union and other partners, maybe Japan and other partners like Australia, but to try and operate as sort of a multipolar world to be really sensible, I think, to New Delhi, given that it's quite difficult to predict how the United States is going to react at any given time, really. So strategically, economically, I think it's a good idea to try and hedge as much as you possibly can, and it's a sensible approach to do that. So I say managing the United States is really important. I guess the other thing is, how does it want to manage its regional relationships as well? So in a region where Bangladesh and Afghanistan, as we mentioned, and Nepal and other countries are going through periods of flux, I think it's going to be really critical to New Delhi and how effective it is in managing those relationships in a way. And I think you touched on a really important point that emphasizes realpolitik as well. So New Delhi is not going to be able to establish maybe the political regimes it's going to be most comfortable with in those countries. But how does it manage that relationship in constructive ways? So economically and strategically, it still protects India's wider national security interests. I think that's going to be absolutely crucial. So moving away from a moralistic approach to international relations or regional relations in that context and just being much more pragmatic and hard-nosed and realpolitik about how you manage those relationships to India's advantage, I think is going to be a key thing. And I guess the third thing is China, obviously always is China. How India deals with China and that relationship, how it manages. I mean, obviously, I guess India's primary concern is to try and avoid any conflict on the border as far as possible. So if you can't resolve the border dispute, which it seems extremely difficult to do, can you stabilize that process so you don't have the border being used by China as a point of leverage over India, and extent to which India can try and negotiate a more sort of productive relationship with China. And obviously, maybe it's been to China recently. It's going to be difficult for that relationship strategically and economically to really gain traction, I think. But I think the key thing is just to make sure it doesn't blow up or we don't get in a stage where we have crisis again, another Galwan, another cyber attack on Mumbai, and the extent to which that can act as an issue. So not necessarily, I guess the thing is how can you manage that China relationship so it doesn't destabilize or disrupt wider Indian economic and strategic interests. Easier said than done, but I think that's something that obviously is the other key component really in Indian foreign policy. If the China relationship goes wrong, then everything else starts to become much more complicated regionally.
True. Because I am taking this as a fundamental note. India has to accept the new realities of South Asian geopolitics and beyond it. We have to know how to deal with the Trump turbulence, and also seeking the new partnership with other key like-minded democracy. For example, the UK, the European Union powers, Australia. And I think the entire Trump chapter gave a very realistic answer to Delhi's reorientation towards foreign policy beyond South Asia. And vis-a-vis with China, the Galwan crisis is still fresh in the memory. And as far as the security apparatus of South Asia is concerned, India's foreign policy is concerned, the new shift we are seeing, which is the realpolitik acceptance when it comes to leveraging intelligence, espionage across Afghanistan, Bangladesh, I believe India is on the right path. And you also mentioned path will be quite difficult for New Delhi, but it can be sustainable if efforts are made on the right direction. So thank you, Dr. Paul. I am very delighted to host you, sir. I had a lot of questions. It could be a very long podcast, but as time constraints, we have to today finish this off here. And the entire council team is, I would say, feeling honored to have you, sir, on our show. And I hope so. We will keep